In the early years of the 19th century, Europe stood frozen in awe and terror before a single man. Napoleon Bonaparte did not merely win battles, he rewrote the rules of power. Kingdoms fell in weeks. Armies dissolved at the sight of his banners. From Madrid to Vienna, from Rome to Berlin, his shadow stretched across the continent. To the outside world, France looked unstoppable. Maps were redrawn again and again, each time with French borders expanding outward like a spreading stain. Napoleon's armies marched with mechanical precision, his generals moved like chess pieces, and his enemies seemed forever one step behind. To most observers, the question was no longer whether Napoleon would dominate Europe, but how long it would take. Yet beneath this image of invincibility, France was quietly bleeding. Not on the battlefield, not in the courts of Europe, but deep inside its economy. Napoleon understood warfare better than almost any commander in history. He mastered logistics, speed, morale, and psychological shock. But there was one battlefield he believed could be conquered the same way as land, and citizen that belief would ultimately destroy his empire. That battlefield was economics. Britain, his most stubborn enemy, could not be defeated by marching armies alone. Protected by the sea and fueled by global trade, Britain survived defeat after defeat on land and simply kept fighting. Napoleon realized that if he could not invade Britain, he would strangle it, cut off its trade, collapse its economy, force it to submit without firing a shot. This idea became the foundation of his grand strategy. In 1806, Napoleon declared economic war on the entire European continent. Ports were closed, trade routes severed, merchants criminalized, neutral nations coerced. The goal was absolute: isolate Britain completely and break its financial backbone. On paper, it was brilliant. Britain depended on trade. Britain depended on shipping. Britain depended on markets across Europe. If Europe stopped buying British goods, Napoleon believed Britain would collapse under the weight of unemployment, debt, and social unrest. But this strategy rested on a fatal assumption. Napoleon believed France and the empire he was building could survive the same isolation he imposed on Britain. He was wrong. France was not self-sufficient. Its industries were weaker, its financial system was fragile, its trade networks were less global, and unlike Britain, France depended heavily on continental commerce to keep its economy alive. The very weapon Napoleon unleashed against Britain would rebound slowly at first, almost invisibly back into France itself. Factories would falter, merchants would rebel, smuggling would explode, allies would quietly turn hostile, treasuries would empty, armies would grow harder to supply. Loyalty would erode not from defeat, but from deprivation. Napoleon's empire did not collapse in a single moment. It collapsed under the accumulated pressure of economic exhaustion. And by the time the battlefield defeats arrived Russia, Spain, Leipzig, the real war had already been lost. This is the story, not of how Napoleon was beaten by generals, but how he was defeated by ledgers, trade routes, inflation, and the limits of economic reality. This is the economic war that broke France. In November 1806, from the conquered city of Berlin, Napoleon issued a decree that would reshape Europe's economy overnight. It was called the Continental System, and it was nothing less than an attempt to weaponize an entire continent against a single island. The decree declared the British Isles under blockade. All trade with Britain was forbidden. British goods were to be seized on sight. Letters, insurance contracts, shipping documents, anything connected to British commerce was declared illegal. Ports from Lisbon to Hamburg were ordered shut. Neutral traders were warned. Allies were coerced. Resistance was punished. Napoleon believed he had discovered Britain's Achilles heel. Britain was not strong, he reasoned, because of its army. It was strong because of money. Its factories fed global markets, its merchants dominated shipping lanes, its banks financed wars while others went bankrupt. Cut the flow of trade, and Britain would suffocate. At first, the plan seemed to work. British exports to Europe dropped sharply. Warehouses filled with unsold goods. Insurance rates spiked. Newspapers in London whispered about unrest, unemployment, and looming crisis. Napoleon celebrated these signs as proof that his strategy was succeeding. But the Continental System demanded something unprecedented: total economic obedience across Europe. And Europe was not a single, unified economy. It was a patchwork of nations, cultures, industries, and interests, many of which depended on British trade just as much as Britain depended on them. Ports like Amsterdam Antwerp, and Hamburg had grown rich as commercial hubs. Merchants in Italy, Germany, and Spain relied on British textiles, machinery, and colonial goods. Farmers sold produce through British intermediaries. Shipbuilders depended on British insurance and finance. To these people, the Continental System was not a patriotic duty. It was an economic death sentence. Smuggling exploded almost immediately. British goods flowed into Europe through back channels via Scandinavia, through the Baltic, across the Iberian coast, hidden in false compartments and mislabeled cargoes. Corrupt officials looked the other way. Entire coastal communities survived by defying Napoleon's laws. To enforce the blockade, Napoleon was forced to expand his control further and further. He occupied Portugal when it refused to comply. That invasion dragged France into Spain, igniting a brutal guerrilla war that would drain French manpower for years. He tightened control over German states, he bullied allies, he replaced monarchs. Each step meant more troops, more money, more resistance. Meanwhile, Britain adapted. Instead of collapsing, British merchants simply redirected trade. They expanded markets in Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. The Royal Navy protected shipping lanes. British industry modernized rapidly, increasing productivity and lowering costs. What Britain lost in European markets, it compensated for elsewhere. France, however, had no such flexibility. French industry was less mechanized. French finance was less global. French merchants lacked Britain's reach. As imports disappeared, shortages spread, prices rose, raw materials became scarce, factories slowed or closed. Urban workers felt the strain, first then rural regions followed. Napoleon had intended the Continental System to starve Britain. Instead, it began to starve his own empire, and to keep the system alive. Napoleon would soon make the most dangerous decision of his reign, one that would turn economic pressure into military catastrophe. By 1808, the Continental System had ceased to be a clean economic strategy and had become a daily struggle against reality itself. On maps in Paris, Europe looked sealed tight. In practice, it was riddled with holes. Smuggling was no longer a crime at the margins of the empire. It was the lifeblood of entire regions. Along the North Sea and the Baltic, fishing villages transformed into covert trade hubs. In Italy and southern France, goods slipped ashore at night. In Germany, merchants quietly rebranded British products as neutral. Even inside France, customs officials poorly paid and increasingly cynical accepted bribes to look the other way. Napoleon responded the only way he knew how, with force. Tariffs were raised, penalties increased. Troops were deployed to ports and borders, warehouses were raided, merchants were arrested. Yet every new restriction created new incentives to cheat. The tighter the grip, the larger the underground economy grew. But smuggling alone was not the real problem. The deeper damage lay in what France could no longer import. British trade had supplied Europe with far more than finished goods. It delivered raw materials, credit, shipping insurance, colonial products, and machinery. When that flow stopped, French industry discovered its limits. Textile mills struggled without cotton. Shipyards lacked timber and pitch. Metalworks faced shortages of coal and iron. Sugar, coffee, and tobacco common became luxuries. Prices rose sharply, especially in cities where wages failed to keep pace. Inflation crept through the empire, quietly eroding trust. Urban workers blamed factory owners blamed the state, merchants blamed Napoleon, and Napoleon blamed Britain and any ally who failed to enforce the blockade perfectly. The French treasury felt the pressure as well. War is expensive, even in victory. Maintaining massive armies across Europe required constant spending, wages, supplies, transport, and administration. Normally, trade would offset some of this cost, but under the Continental System, customs revenues declined, commerce shrank, and tax collection grew more difficult. Napoleon compensated by squeezing harder. New taxes were imposed. Contributions were extracted from conquered territories. Client states were drained to fund the imperial machine. On paper, this looked sustainable. In reality, it bred resentment and quiet resistance. France's allies were becoming reluctant partners. The Dutch economy suffered so badly that Napoleon eventually abolished the Kingdom of Holland altogether and annexed it directly. German states complied publicly while undermining the blockade privately. Italy groaned under economic stagnation. Spain erupted into open rebellion. Everywhere, the same pattern emerged. Economic pain translated into political instability. Yet Napoleon remained convinced that the system would work if only it were enforced perfectly. This belief pushed him toward an ever more dangerous conclusion. Britain's last open trade route ran through Russia, and if Russia could not be controlled economically, it would have to be confronted militarily. The economic war had reached its limit. To save the Continental System and his empire, Napoleon prepared to gamble everything on one final move. At first, Russia appeared to be Napoleon's indispensable partner. After the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, Tsar Alexander I formally joined the Continental System, closing Russian ports to British trade and aligning his empire with France. On paper, this sealed Britain's fate. In reality, it created a contradiction that could not last. Russia's economy depended heavily on exports of grain, timber, hemp, and raw materials, much of which flowed through British shipping networks. British merchants offered better prices, better insurance, and faster payment than any continental alternative. When trade with Britain stopped, Russian revenues collapsed almost immediately. Grain piled up unsold, nobles lost income, state finances weakened, inflation followed. Worse still, Russia needed imports just as badly as it needed exports. Machinery, manufactured goods, and colonial products vanished from Russian markets. Shortages spread. Smuggling surged across the Baltic and through neutral intermediaries. By 1810, Alexander quietly began relaxing enforcement of the blockade. French officials noticed, Napoleon noticed. To Napoleon, Russia's defiance was not merely an economic issue, it was an existential threat. If Russia reopened its ports, Britain would regain access to the continent. The Continental System would unravel completely, and with it, Napoleon's vision of a Europe united under French dominance. Napoleon responded with pressure. He tightened tariffs. He annexed territories along the North Sea to close remaining trade routes. He issued increasingly aggressive demands toward Russia, insisting on full compliance. Diplomatic relations deteriorated rapidly. But Russia had its own logic. The Tsar had no intention of destroying his own economy to protect Napoleon's prestige. Russia was vast, agricultural, and less dependent on industrial trade than Western Europe. Britain could hurt Russia, but France could not replace Britain as a trading partner. By 1811, both sides understood that the alliance was finished. The economic war had become a political standoff, and the political standoff was drifting toward military confrontation. Napoleon made a decision that would define his downfall. If Russia would not comply economically, it would be forced to comply militarily. In 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 men drawn from across his empire, French, German, Italian, Polish, and Allied contingents. It was an army designed not just to defeat Russia on the battlefield, but to compel obedience to the Continental System. The invasion of Russia was, at its core, an economic campaign. Napoleon believed that a swift victory would bring Alexander back into line, restore the blockade, and finally break Britain. He underestimated three things: Russia's willingness to retreat, the vastness of its territory, and the fragility of his own logistical system. Supply lines stretched impossibly thin. Food shortages appeared almost immediately. Smuggling could not save an army marching through scorched land. Winter did the rest. When the Grand Army staggered out of Russia months later, fewer than 100,000 men remained. The economic weapon Napoleon had built had now destroyed his greatest military asset. France would never recover from this blow, and yet, even after Russia, the deeper damage had already been done. Not just to armies, but to France's financial foundations. The empire was bleeding economically, and the final collapse was now inevitable. By the time the remnants of the Grand Army returned from Russia, the French Empire was no longer held together by momentum, but by exhaustion. The economic strain that had once been hidden behind victory was now exposed. France was drowning in costs. Years of continuous warfare had drained the treasury. Armies had to be rebuilt. Garrisons still occupied hostile territories. Roads, ports, and fortifications demanded constant funding. Yet the economic engine meant to sustain this machine, the Continental System, was failing everywhere at once. Trade had not recovered. It had withered. Merchants avoided risk. Capital fled into hiding. Investment slowed to a crawl. In many regions, people reverted to barter or local exchange, bypassing imperial markets altogether. The empire looked large on maps, but economically, it was fragmenting into disconnected pockets of scarcity. Blockade fatigue set in. Officials grew tired of enforcement. Soldiers deserted customs posts. Allies openly ignored regulations. Even within France, compliance faded as people chose survival over ideology. The Continental System required discipline from millions of people who no longer believed in its purpose. Napoleon's response was increasingly desperate. He demanded more taxes, more conscripts, more contributions from allied states. These demands were framed as temporary necessities, but they came year after year. What had once felt like shared sacrifice now felt like extraction. Client states began to break away not because they hated France, but because France could no longer afford to keep them loyal. The economic relationship had reversed. Instead of empire feeding the center was bleeding the periphery dry. France's financial system, already weaker than Britain's, cracked under the strain. Unlike London, Paris lacked deep capital markets, global credit networks, and institutional trust. Borrowing became harder. Inflation reappeared. Confidence eroded. Meanwhile, Britain endured. Despite setbacks, British trade adapted yet again. The Royal Navy maintained control of the seas. Industrial output continued to grow. British finance absorbed shocks that would have crippled any continental power. The longer the war dragged on, the clearer the contrast became. Napoleon had tried to fight a maritime industrial empire with land-based coercion. The mismatch was fatal. By 1813, the consequences converged. France lacked the resources to replace lost armies at scale. Allies defected, coalition forces advanced. The war shifted from offense to defense, and defense is always more expensive. When Napoleon was finally defeated and exiled in 1814, the collapse was often explained in military terms: battles lost, generals betrayed, strategies misjudged. But beneath every battlefield failure lay the same reality. The empire was economically broken long before it was militarily defeated. France had not been outmaneuvered, it had been outlasted. And the final lesson of Napoleon's fall would only become clear in hindsight. When historians recount Napoleon's downfall, they often focus on dramatic images: frozen soldiers retreating from Moscow, cavalry charges at Waterloo, coalitions closing in from every side. These moments feel decisive, cinematic, and final, but they were not the cause. They were the symptoms. Long before Napoleon lost his last battle, he had already lost the war that mattered most, the economic one. Britain did not defeat Napoleon by invading France. It defeated him by surviving, by enduring blockade, adapting trade routes, expanding industry, and leveraging global finance. Britain forced Napoleon into an impossible position. Every year, the war continued favored the island nation with deeper capital markets, flexible institutions, and naval dominance. Napoleon, by contrast, ruled a continental empire built for conquest, not for economic resilience. The Continental System was supposed to compensate for naval weakness. Instead, it exposed structural flaws in France's economy: limited industrialization, fragile credit, dependence on coercion rather than consent. An empire can conquer territory quickly. It cannot rewire economic reality at the same speed. To maintain the illusion of control, Napoleon escalated more enforcement, more annexations, more wars. Each step increased costs while shrinking returns. Spain bled manpower, Russia destroyed the army, Germany and Italy drained resources. France itself bore the weight of endless mobilization. This was not miscalculation alone. It was a misunderstanding of power. Napoleon believed power flowed from armies, borders, and obedience. Britain understood that power flowed from production, trade, and finance. One empire fought with muskets and marching orders. The other fought with credit, shipping lanes, and factories. When the system finally collapsed, it collapsed everywhere at once. Allies defected because France could no longer pay or protect them. Armies weakened because the economy could not sustain them. Popular support eroded because people were asked to sacrifice endlessly for a strategy that offered no relief. By the time Napoleon returned from exile for his final gamble in 1815, the outcome was already sealed. Waterloo was not the end of the story, it was the epilogue. The real defeat had occurred years earlier, in ports choked by shortages, factories slowed by missing materials, and treasuries emptied by overreach. Napoleon did not fall because he lacked genius. He fell because genius cannot override economics forever. Empires rise when their economic foundations expand faster than their ambitions. They fall when ambition outruns capacity. Napoleon's empire burned brightly, but it consumed itself to stay lit. The economic war that was meant to break Britain instead broke France. And that is the real reason Napoleon lost.